Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently carry you through the quiet golden sands of time into the shadowy alcoves of ancient Egypt, where kings walked as gods and the desert wind whispered secrets through stone temples. In this story, we shall drift through the lives of some of Egypt's most formidable and feared pharaohs, rulers not remembered for their benevolence, but for the darkness they cast upon their realms. These were men who shaped history through iron will and cold decree, their names etched not only in stone, but in the quiet fears of those who once served them. So make yourself cozy, close your eyes if you'd like, and let us begin. It began long before the world knew marble columns and grand empires, before Rome rose or Athens sang of wisdom. Along the banks of the Nile, steady and eternal, there rose a civilization unmatched in its depth and dignity. Within this river-fed cradle of life stood kings cloaked not only in gold and linen, but in myth. To be a pharaoh was not merely to reign, it was to be the living Horus, the walking sun, the god-made flesh. Such belief gave license to greatness, but also to cruelty. And so our tale begins not with the building of a monument, but with the echo of a scream lost to time. Pharaoh Nama, unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt, is where many scribes begin the story of Egypt's grandeur. But long after his time, during the age now known as the Old Kingdom, there emerged a ruler less often praised in temple hymns, Pharaoh Djer. Though praised in formal records as a mighty king of the First Dynasty, whispers from the tombs tell a story far less serene. Djer's reign is wrapped in the shroud of mystery, like so many rulers whose memory flickers through broken stelae and faded reliefs. His was a time of conquest, when Egypt was young and the Red Land, the deserts beyond the fertile Nile, still threatened the balance of civilization. Djer saw not a land to protect, but a kingdom to possess, utterly and entirely. His enemies were not merely defeated, they were erased, reduced to ash or sacrificed in rituals meant to appease gods now long forgotten. In the royal necropolis of Abydos, Djer's tomb still stands, surrounded by subsidiary graves, hundreds of them. Archaeologists long believed these were retainers, honoured in death to serve their master in the afterlife. But careful study revealed something far more chilling. These servants had been sacrificed, their lives ended to accompany their king beyond the veil. Men, women, even children, buried alive or strangled, their bones arranged around the pharaoh's eternal home like mute guardians. Was this an act of spiritual devotion or a demonstration of divine entitlement taken to horrifying extremes? In truth, there is no one left who can say, but the silence of those tombs speaks volumes, a silence deeper than stone. From Djer's cruel display of power, we drift gently forward through time to a ruler who would make even the harshness of ritual death seem but a shadow. Meet Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, the pharaoh behind the Great Pyramid of Giza, a monument so vast and enduring it defies reason. To the world, Khufu is remembered as the architect of wonder, a builder who stretched his will toward the heavens. But behind this marvel lies a tale woven with blood and bone. Beneath the glinting limestone and precise geometry of the pyramid, whispers tell of forced labour, unyielding demands, and a reign of iron discipline. Though modern historians debate the true nature of the workforce, whether they were enslaved or conscripted, the ancient Egyptians themselves left clues that hint at a darker truth. In later writings, Khufu is not celebrated for kindness or wisdom. He is recalled as cruel, capricious, and indifferent to suffering. In the Westcar Papyrus, a story survives of Khufu demanding that a magician sacrifice a man to demonstrate his powers, a tale likely apocryphal, but revealing in its essence. The pharaoh's image in folk memory had become a symbol of unchecked power, a ruler for whom the construction of greatness justified any cost. The tombs of workers discovered near Giza show signs of grueling toil, of lives shortened by injury and exhaustion. Whether they laboured willingly or under compulsion, their sacrifice fed the ego of a king determined to outlast death. And Khufu did. His pyramid still stands, the last of the seven wonders, an eternal shadow on the desert floor. But in the quiet of night, when wind rattles through stone corridors and the stars flicker above the plateau, one might wonder if the price was ever worth it. Did he gaze upon his monument in life and feel pride? Or did he, perhaps in fleeting moments, feel the weight of 1,000 broken backs pressing upon his soul? But the story does not end in stone. In time, cruelty would take new forms, no longer bound to pyramids or sacrificial pits, but expressed in paranoia, manipulation, and merciless judgment. And so we drift onward to the Middle Kingdom, where a different kind of cruelty emerged, quieter, more calculating, yet no less devastating. Pharaoh Senusret III, often called the Warrior King, is hailed in history for his administrative prowess and military campaigns. His statues are severe, his features carved not with serene majesty but with grim determination. Gone is the placid face of earlier kings. In its place, a visage of furrowed brow and hardened jaw, the face of a ruler who saw not beauty in the world, but threat. Senusret waged war beyond Egypt's southern border into Nubia, where he built fortresses and subjugated peoples with brutal efficiency. Unlike Khufu, who ruled through vision, Senusret ruled through fear. His conquests were systematic, his governance merciless. Rebellions were crushed without ceremony, and loyalty was purchased not with favour but with the clear demonstration of consequence. He is credited with reshaping Egypt into a more centralised and powerful state. Yet that power came at a cost. Local governors were stripped of autonomy, temples brought under royal control, voices silenced in favour of uniformity. A land once vibrant with local traditions became a monochrome of royal decree. Beneath the grandeur of his achievements lies a kingdom frightened into order, held together not by devotion but dread. Even in death, Senusret sought dominance, constructing a labyrinthine tomb designed to confound and deceive, a mirror perhaps of the man himself, complex, concealed and dangerous. As the stars turn above the Nile and the papyrus reeds sway gently along its banks, we linger here for now, with the echoes of three kings whose legacies are painted not only in gold but in shadow. Their names endure, carved deep into the bones of history, while those who suffered beneath them remain nameless and still. We rest here, for the night grows deep. The Nile flowed on, indifferent and eternal, its gentle current carrying silt and memory alike. With each passing dynasty, the great river bore witness to an ever-changing parade of rulers, some wise and gracious, others cloaked in darker intentions. As the Old Kingdom waned and the Middle Kingdom tightened its grasp, Egypt had already grown familiar with the sharp edge of power. But true tyranny, as quiet and insidious as a serpent sliding through the reeds, would take on a more refined form in the centuries to come. Now our gaze settles upon a name that echoes with eerie weight, Akhenaten. Once called Amenhotep IV, his was a reign that fractured tradition and isolated a kingdom under the banner of devotion, not to his people, nor to his ancestors, but to a singular burning god. Akhenaten's cruelty did not take the obvious form of whip or sword. He did not enslave thousands to build grand tombs, nor did he lay waste to cities with military might. His tyranny was of the spirit, a slow suffocation of the beliefs and comforts that had steadied Egyptian life for generations. He began his rule within the warm embrace of tradition, the son of Amenhotep III, a pharaoh beloved for prosperity and balance. But early in his reign, something shifted. Whether through vision or madness, Akhenaten turned away from the pantheon of gods that had nourished Egypt for centuries. The temples of Amun, Osiris, Isis and Thoth were shuttered. Their priests were dismissed, their statues defaced. In their place, he proclaimed the supremacy of a single deity, Aten, the sun disk, faceless and formless. To worship Aten, he built a new capital, Akhet, horizon of the Aten, in a desolate stretch of land, far from the sacred cities of Thebes and Memphis. There, in whitewashed temples open to the sky, he composed hymns to the sunlight, depicting himself and his queen Nefertiti as the only intermediaries between God and man. It was a beautiful illusion, radiant, serene, and utterly oppressive. For the priests of the old gods, the decree was nothing short of exile. Their power and influence, centuries in the making, vanished overnight. Temples once bustling with ritual fell into silence, their walls scraped clean of divine names. Cities that had flourished around these spiritual centres decayed, their people adrift in a new theology that offered neither comfort nor clarity. The people of Egypt, long accustomed to praying to gods who felt close and familiar, the falcon of Horus, the jackal of Anubis, the motherly arms of Hathor, were now instructed to bow before an abstract force they could not touch or name. In this spiritual famine, Akhenaten declared himself the living bridge to Aten. There was no room for dissent, for other gods, or for the personal piety that once thrived in humble shrines. Though the pharaoh's artistic legacy has captured modern fascination, with its delicate lines, intimate family scenes, and elongated features, beneath the surface was a society unravelling. The Amarna period, as it came to be known, was not one of joy and rebirth, but of alienation. Trade routes faltered, military strength dwindled, and once loyal provinces began to question the strength of the throne. Records from the time grow scarce, as if the very scribes lost the will to write. One letter from a vassal king in Canaan pleads desperately for Egyptian troops, warning that enemies were closing in. "They are taking all the lands," he writes, "and the king of Egypt does not care." Akhenaten, wrapped in his private rituals beneath the open sky, gave no answer. Even his family could not escape the shadow of his obsession. His daughters, depicted lovingly in palace reliefs, vanish from the record one by one. Nefertiti, his queen, once exalted as co-ruler, disappears mysteriously during the latter years of his reign. Whether by illness, heartbreak, or the cruel politics of the court, she too was swallowed by the silent sands of Akhenaten. When Akhenaten died, the dream crumbled swiftly. His successors, first Smenkhare, then the boy king Tutankhamun, struggled to restore what had been lost. The capital was abandoned, the old gods reinstated, and Akhenaten's name was struck from monuments. The great experiment had failed, and Egypt exhaled in relief, even as the scars remained. But cruelty does not always retreat with the fall of one man. Sometimes it merely takes on a new face. In the twilight of the 19th dynasty, another pharaoh would ascend, one whose rule would stand as a cautionary tale of ego unchecked. His name was Ramesses III, a name that shimmered with promise, for he took it from the great Ramesses II, the so-called great ancestor. But where his predecessor had ruled with vision and strength, Ramesses III would cling to power through suspicion and severity until his kingdom began to crumble from within. He inherited a realm in decline. Foreign invasions, economic strain, and internal unrest threatened the stability of Egypt. And so Ramesses III responded, as many desperate rulers do, by tightening his grip. His reign saw a marked rise in executions, especially of officials and nobles deemed disloyal. Whispers of dissent were met with brutal consequence, and the once proud bureaucracy bent under the weight of fear. Yet his most infamous legacy was not in how he ruled the living, but in how he was felled by the deadliest of conspiracies, a plot from within his own harem. The so-called harem conspiracy is among the most chilling episodes in pharaonic history. It tells of Tia, a lesser wife of the king, who sought to place her son Pentuer on the throne. Together with a cadre of palace officials, magicians and servants, she orchestrated a plan to assassinate the pharaoh, during the sacred Opet festival, no less. The conspiracy was vast and meticulously planned. Spells were cast, guards were bribed, and messages passed in coded papyri. But something went wrong. The plot was uncovered and trials ensued. What followed was a wave of purges and punishments so severe that it left an indelible stain on the end of Ramesses' reign. Some of the conspirators were forced to take their own lives, others were mutilated or burned. Pentuer himself, the prince at the centre of the plot, is believed to have died by suicide, possibly forced, as his mummy bears the contorted face of one who died in agony. And Ramesses III, for years, scholars believed he had survived the attempt. But in 2012, modern scans of his mummy revealed a deep gash across his throat, nearly severed, and signs of trauma elsewhere. The king had not escaped, he had been murdered, just as the conspirators had intended, even if their plan ultimately failed to claim the throne. His death marked the beginning of the end. The dynasty faltered. The power of the pharaohs, once as solid as the pyramids themselves, began to fade like mist at dawn. And still, the Nile flowed on. Night deepened across the two lands, and the stars above the desert burned with cold brilliance. The monuments of old still stood, battered by time but unbowed, their stones humming softly with the burdens they carried. As each dynasty faded, leaving behind its mosaics of glory and grief, a new ruler would rise to claim the throne of Horus. Some would heal what had been broken, others would only deepen the cracks. Now our path leads us into the third intermediate period, a time of splintered rule and uncertain loyalties. Egypt, once unified and resplendent, was no longer one kingdom but many, its heart divided between north and south, its temples dominated by high priests, its throne contested by warriors and warlords. In this fractured world, power became more personal, more desperate. It was a time when cruelty did not announce itself with grand proclamations, but with quiet betrayals and sudden deaths. One such figure emerged from the confusion like a shadow in smoke, Osorkon III, a Libyan-descended pharaoh whose rule was marked not only by unrest, but by the cunning use of force, cloaked beneath ceremony. Osorkon III held sway over Upper Egypt in a time when kings were no longer divine in the eyes of all their people. His legitimacy was tenuous and his enemies numerous. Yet he ruled for nearly 3 decades, maintaining a tight grip through relentless elimination of rivals and manipulation of religious institutions. His cruelty was precise, clinical, administered not through mass violence, but through the cold machinery of palace politics. He did not need to raise his voice or unsheathe a blade himself. Instead, he turned temples into tools of dominion, demanding loyalty not only from priests, but from the gods they served. Those who opposed him, whether in the clergy, the courts, or the royal family, found themselves quietly erased. Their names were chiseled from inscriptions, their titles stripped, their bodies buried without ceremony, if buried at all. Whispers tell of one prince, a distant cousin and popular voice among the southern cities, who dared to question Osorkon's rule. He was summoned to Thebes under the pretense of negotiation. He never returned. No records survive of his fate, but a single ostracon fragment, found centuries later near the Karnak temple, bears the hastily scratched phrase, "The mouth is sealed, the blood is dry." Whether curse or confession, it hints at a silent disappearance. Even the sacred oracle processions, rituals where gods were carried in gilded barges to render divine judgments, were turned to Osorkon's will. Priests who interpreted the god's answers too freely were replaced. The god's voice became the king's voice. And when the barge swayed toward a rival's estate, marking them for divine favour, it was not the gods who had chosen, but Osorkon's hand beneath the velvet canopy. And yet, in his final years, the shadows grew longer. Famine crept through the land. Trade routes, long precarious, began to wither. Thebes fell into quiet tension. The gods no longer answered so quickly. And though his tomb was prepared with all the rites befitting a ruler, it was never found. Some believe it lies hidden still, while others whisper it was desecrated by those who had once bowed before him. But while Osorkon ruled through precision, others wielded cruelty with passion, raw and explosive, like fire in dry grass. So we turn our gaze to a time not long after when yet another foreign-born dynasty rose to power, the 25th, the Kushite kings from Nubia. Among them, one figure stands not merely for conquest but for retribution, a king named Shabaka. Shabaka saw himself as a restorer, a purifier of Egypt's ancient ways. His rule came in the wake of centuries of chaos, and with the fervour of belief, he sought to resurrect the old gods, the old rites, the old truths. But restoration, when driven by zeal, can become a weapon, and Shabaka used it to destroy all that challenged his vision. He began by crushing his enemies with overwhelming force. The princes of Lower Egypt, accustomed to local rule and autonomy, were given one chance to submit. Those who did not were hunted down. Some were impaled along the Nile as a warning. Others were cast into temple pits, their names blotted out with ash and resin. Shabaka made a show of piety, rededicating temples and funding priesthoods, but beneath the veneer was the unmistakable message, obey or be obliterated. Even the dead were not spared. One of the more chilling acts attributed to Shabaka was the destruction of royal tombs belonging to rival dynasties. He is said to have desecrated the burial sites of kings from the Libyan lines, removing offerings, breaking statues and scattering bones. Whether out of vengeance or as a declaration of his divine right, the result was clear. He did not merely defeat his enemies, he unmade them. In Memphis, the ancient capital of kings, he declared his rule with thunderous ceremony, carving his decrees into a great black stone, the Shabaka stone, preserving old texts and divine order. Yet the very same monument is believed by some to contain subtle edits, rewritten truths, designed to align history with his reign. To control the past was to control eternity. And still, despite the severity of his methods, many worshipped him as a restorer of balance. For Shabaka had the charisma of a prophet king, speaking not in threats but in visions. He cast his brutality as devotion, his purges as cleansing. The line between godliness and tyranny blurred. When he died, his body was returned south to the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal in Nubia, where he was buried not like a pharaoh of Egypt, but like a king of Kush, his sarcophagus adorned with hybrid symbols, half Egyptian, half African, as if even in death he straddled two worlds. His successors would carry on his vision, but with each generation the zeal would fade, and the cruelty of forced reverence would give way to fatigue. And so Egypt stumbled toward its twilight, one foot still in its golden past, the other in the shifting sands of foreign dominion. But before that twilight fully fell, one more figure would rise, not born of Kush or Libya, but within the very heart of Egypt. His name was Psamtik-Wers, and while his reign promised stability, it would also revive a cold cruelty that had long lain dormant, the cruelty of order without mercy, of peace purchased through silence. But for now, the river flows quiet once more, and the reed boats drift lazily beneath the moon, as if forgetting for a moment the blood that once stained their path. The dawn of the 26th dynasty arrived like a faint breath across the scorched land. After centuries of fragmentation, invasion and uncertainty, Egypt longed for stability. It yearned for a ruler who might restore the old majesty without tipping the scales toward madness. Into this moment stepped Psamtik-Wers, or Psammetichus as the Greeks would later call him, a man both cautious and calculating, whose reign marked the beginning of the so-called Scythe Renaissance. Yet beneath his polished exterior lay a cold efficiency that turned the gears of power with unnerving precision. Psamtik rose to prominence not by divine right nor revolutionary fervour, but through the subtle currents of politics and foreign alliance. At first, he was but one of several regional leaders vying for dominance in a fractured land. But with the aid of mercenaries from distant shores, Greeks, Carians and others drawn by coin more than loyalty, he slowly uncoiled his influence from the delta to the banks of Thebes. His rule was hailed as a return to order. The temples reopened, priests were reinstated, and art once again flourished with the echoes of Old Kingdom forms. Yet this illusion of golden rebirth came at a hidden cost. Psamtik was not a king who ruled by love, but by the quiet removal of all who could oppose him. His enemies were not crushed on the battlefield, but vanished in the folds of bureaucracy and ritual. Records suggest that Psamtik encouraged the restoration of Egypt's legal and administrative systems, but these reforms served as a trap as much as a foundation. Trials were formalised, yet no defence could be mounted against an accusation from the throne. Taxes were codified, yet the burden fell heaviest on those least able to bear it. Dissent, even whispered among temple walls, was met with exile or worse, erasure. Even within his family, loyalty was demanded above all else. His sons and daughters were placed strategically across Egypt's power structures, but none were beyond suspicion. One tale, passed down in fragments by later Greek writers, speaks of a noble son who questioned the king's growing reliance on foreign soldiers. Days later, the young man was sent on a mission to the far frontier and never returned. No mourning was permitted. His name was not inscribed among the royal lineage. The king's relationship with the Greeks, though politically brilliant, further fueled unrest among the native populace. Psamtik offered them land, wealth, and positions of influence, even allowing them to found their own settlement at Naucratis, a port city that became a bustling trade hub. But while these arrangements strengthened his hold on the economy and foreign policy, they also planted quiet seeds of resentment among the priesthood and common people, who saw the old order bending to strange tongues and customs. Still, Psamtik was careful, always careful. His public persona was that of the wise administrator, the guardian of Ma'at, cosmic order, and he ensured that the scribes carved his deeds into stone with language so measured it left no room for criticism. Statues of the king depict him with the serene, unyielding expression of the gods, as though even marble feared to displease him. Yet those same monuments often show him towering over bound captives, foreign and native alike. A subtle reminder that order was to be kept not by compassion, but by absolute control. As years passed and Egypt settled once again into the rhythms of a strong central rule, the edges of Psamtik's policy began to reveal sharper truths. While temples were rebuilt, their independence was curtailed. While priests regained favour, they were tethered tightly to the throne, their divine insight restricted to what served royal interests. Local rulers, once autonomous in their nomes, were bound by heavy surveillance and rigid expectations. And always the Greek soldiers remained. Their presence in Memphis and the Delta cities was not merely tolerated, but required. A constant reminder that Psamtik's Egypt was one stitched together with both native thread and foreign needle. He died peacefully, a rare feat among pharaohs, having ruled for over half a century. His tomb, though modest by ancient standards, was filled with the carefully curated signs of piety, order, and renewal. But in the quiet between the carved hieroglyphs, one might sense something colder, a regime that had preserved the body of Egypt, but had hollowed its soul. Still, Psamtik's shadow stretched long across the land, and his successors would inherit both the strength of his foundations and the hidden fractures beneath them. Among them was a man who would take Psamtik's strategies and sharpen them to a fine edge. His name was Apries, or Wahibre Haibre, a king whose rule would end in flame and betrayal, but not before he had carved his own legend into the Nile's long memory. Apries inherited the throne at a time of apparent prosperity. Egypt's influence had spread into the Levant once more, and the country's wealth was reflected in lavish temple projects and vibrant international trade. Yet prosperity, in the hands of a man too proud, can become a breeding ground for arrogance. From the start, Apries governed with a confidence that bordered on blindness. He continued and expanded his grandfather's policies, leaning heavily on Greek mercenaries and granting them ever more privileges, while marginalising the native Egyptian army. Though he believed this reliance made him untouchable, it instead sowed deep bitterness among his own people, especially among the warrior class, long accustomed to defending the land with honour. The breaking point came during a military disaster in Palestine. Apries sent an army of native Egyptians to support his allies in the region, but they were ambushed and slaughtered, their campaign a dismal failure. Rumours swirled that the king had deliberately sabotaged the effort, favouring his Greek allies over his own subjects. Whether true or not, the perception was enough. Mutiny flared like dry reeds in the sun. The native army turned against the king, rallying behind a general named Amasis, who had once served Apries but now stood as his fiercest challenger. The people followed Amasis not out of ambition, but out of desperation, longing for a ruler who would restore dignity to their own. Apries, in a panic, called upon his foreign troops to defend the throne. The streets of Memphis echoed with the clash of languages and loyalties, but in the end, the king's grip slipped. His Greek forces could not hold back the tide of betrayal that surged through the land. He fled to Babylon, seeking refuge, and for a moment it seemed he might fade into exile. But cruelty has its echoes. Apries returned, bolstered by Babylonian forces intent on reclaiming what he believed was still his by right. The final confrontation came in the Delta, where Egyptian fought Egyptian, foreign against native, in a battle that tore open the old wounds of Psamtik's legacy. Apries lost. Captured and humiliated, he was brought before Amasis, not as a king, but as a traitor. Though Amasis had promised him safe treatment, the promise proved fleeting. The former pharaoh was quietly strangled, his body given over to burial with as little ceremony as possible. Not even the dignity of death could soften his downfall, and so ended the reign of a king undone not by invasion or rebellion, but by the cruelty of his own disconnection. He had ruled with entitlement, wielding favour like a weapon, blind to the slow erosion beneath his golden throne. The Nile, as ever, bore it all in silence. Twilight lingered over the temples of Sais, casting long shadows across the limestone walls still etched with the names of vanished kings. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, though the gods to whom it drifted seemed more distant than ever. Amasis now ruled in Apries' stead, a general turned pharaoh, elevated by rebellion and necessity. Yet, though he promised the return of balance, the wounds of betrayal ran deep, and the path that stretched before him would be marked not by healing, but by the cold calculus of preservation at any cost. Amasis, or Amosekh as he was formerly known, began his reign with cleverness. He understood what had failed his predecessor and moved quickly to appease the native priesthoods, restoring temple lands and favouring traditional rituals. He courted the people with gestures of humility, emphasizing his roots as a commoner, one who had risen not from divine blood, but from the dust of the same earth they tilled. But beneath the surface of this folksy charm pulsed a ruthless pragmatism. Amasis had seized the throne by force, and he knew the crown would rest heavy and uncertain upon his brow. To keep it, he would not hesitate to isolate, silence, or destroy anyone who posed a threat, whether real or imagined. His earliest acts included purges of the royal court, clearing away those still loyal to Apries. Some were exiled, others vanished behind palace walls and were never seen again. The scribes did not record their names. The statues that bore their likenesses were repurposed or defaced, their eyes gouged from stone as if to erase their very witness. Even among his own allies, Amasis sowed distrust. Power was carefully distributed to prevent any one noble from rising too far. Prominent families were bound to the throne through marriage or coerced favour, and their sons were sent to distant garrisons, an honour on the surface, but in truth, a way to separate them from the centres of influence. In public, Amasis laughed and drank and celebrated the old ways. In private, he watched, listened, and remembered. His relationship with the Greeks, too, revealed the sharp edge of his rule. Though he reduced their military dominance after Apries' fall, he did not cast them out. Instead, he transformed them into merchants and envoys, allowing them to flourish under careful supervision. The city of Naucratis became their sanctioned domain, a place where they could trade, worship, and live, but never forget whose land they walked upon. This duality, warmth on the outside, iron beneath, defined Amasis' long reign. For nearly 4 decades, he held Egypt in a tense balance. He sent gifts to foreign kings, cultivated art and architecture, and even supported philosophers in distant Ionia. But back home, the land was growing brittle beneath the weight of his control. Rebellions in the south were met with swift, merciless suppression. Entire villages were razed, their leaders paraded in chains through the streets of Thebes. Taxation increased to fund both the army and the court's extravagance, leading to murmurs among the farmers and craftsmen who felt the yoke tighten year by year. One particularly sombre tale speaks of a scribe who dared to question the fairness of grain levies during a temple audit. He had served loyally for 2 decades, yet after a closed tribunal, he was declared guilty of insubordination. His scrolls were burned, and he was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the necropolis, not as an enemy, but as one unworthy of remembrance. In time, even the gods seemed to recoil from the pretense of harmony. The Nile's floodwaters grew erratic, crops withered, omens appeared in the stars. The people, once charmed by Amasis' image of the good-natured everyman, began to sense the shadow that trailed behind him. Still, few dared speak against the king, for his spies reached far and his wrath was unhesitating. It was in these later years that a threat emerged from beyond Egypt's horizon, one that no amount of policy or parade could appease. Persia, under the rise of the Achaemenid kings, began to cast its gaze westward. Cambyses the Sect, son of Cyrus the Great, harboured ambitions that would soon stretch to the Nile itself. Amasis, aware of this storm gathering in the distance, sought alliances to protect his kingdom. He gave his daughter in marriage to the Persian king, or so he claimed. In truth, he sent the daughter of a nobleman, unwilling to give up royal blood. The deception, once uncovered, incensed Cambyses. It was a slight he would not forget. And so, as Amasis grew old, weary from rule, the first ripples of war began to lap against Egypt's eastern frontier. The king died before the invasion came, slipping into death with neither ceremony nor grandeur, a quiet passing for one who had held so much power for so long. He was succeeded by his son Psamtik III, a young man untested in governance, unprepared for the world that awaited him. Cambyses marched upon Egypt like a tidal wave. The Egyptian army hastily assembled could not hold. Battle was joined at Pelusium, and what followed would become one of the darkest chapters in Egypt's long and storied life. Psamtik, captured and humiliated, was brought in chains before the Persian king. His family was paraded before him, their execution ordered as he watched. Still, he did not weep. Still, he did not bow. But when his son was killed before his eyes, a single tear escaped him. Cambyses, curious at this sudden show of grief, questioned him. "Why do you cry only now?" Psamtik replied, "I did not cry for myself, nor my country. but for the fate of a father who must witness the death of his son. For a moment, even the Persian king faltered, yet mercy was not to be found. Psamtik was forced to drink poison. His reign, barely 6 months long, ended in silence. Thus fell the native line of Egyptian pharaohs. With Psamtik's death, Egypt passed into foreign hands, and the age of independent kings came to a close. The temples stood still, the palaces quieted, and the sands drifted over the names of those who had once ruled, cruel and proud. Yet even in the cold grip of empire, cruelty would not vanish. It would return in new forms, sometimes disguised as order, sometimes cloaked in madness. The throne of Egypt, now a jewel in the crown of Persia, would soon pass to a man whose wrath knew no bounds. His name was Cambyses. And what he did to Egypt would be remembered not with sorrow, but with dread. The desert winds carried whispers now not in Egyptian, but in Old Persian, clipped syllables and foreign commands echoing through palace halls where once only the voice of the pharaoh had ruled. The year was no longer marked by the rising of the Nile alone, but by the passing of satraps, emissaries, and conquerors. Egypt had fallen, and at its helm now stood Cambyses II, the Achaemenid king, a man whose ambition had swept him across the known world, and whose cruelty would leave scars that no sandstorm could erase. Cambyses did not enter Egypt as a stranger. He arrived as a shadow already looming for years, whispered of in temples, feared in marketplaces. Son of Cyrus the Great, he had inherited not only an empire, but a restless hunger for more. When Psamtik III fell, Cambyses did not merely claim victory. He claimed the gods, the culture, the very soul of Egypt, and in doing so he sought not just to rule the land, but to remake it in his image. His first act was theatrical, calculated and deeply ominous. The sacred city of Sais, where Amasis had reigned and where the tradition of the Site dynasty still lingered, was desecrated. Temples were plundered, statues defaced and priests stripped of their authority. Though Cambyses publicly declared himself a legitimate pharaoh, adopting the titles, making offerings, his actions betrayed his true disdain for Egyptian religion. He targeted Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, believed to be a living embodiment of the god Ptah. When a new Apis bull was discovered, a moment of celebration for the faithful, Cambyses turned the joy into horror. According to Egyptian sources, he ordered the bull slain with his own hand, mocking the priests and the people. Blood stained the temple floors where incense once rose in prayer. The story, preserved by Greek historian Herodotus, may be embellished, but its resonance remains chilling. Whether literal or symbolic, it reflected the violence of cultural domination. Those who resisted the new regime, priesthoods, local nobles, scribes who refused to bend the knee, were purged with ruthless efficiency. Entire temple libraries were looted or destroyed, sacred rituals were outlawed. The chant of daily hymns was replaced by silence, or worse, by foreign chants none could understand. The gods, long venerated through countless dynasties, were now prisoners in their own shrines. But Cambyses' fury extended beyond religion. He distrusted those closest to him, suspecting treachery at every turn. His satraps, even those loyal in the extreme, were subject to sudden punishment. One tale speaks of a governor in the Delta region who, upon failing to deliver tribute in full, was flayed alive, his skin nailed to the walls of his own court as a warning. Such acts were not isolated. Cambyses moved through Egypt like a fever, unpredictable, consuming and cruel. Some say he descended into madness, that the heat and unfamiliar customs broke his mind. Others argue his violence was strategic, meant to instill such fear that no rebellion could take root. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Egypt bled under his rule. Even his own family was not spared. Cambyses had brought with him relatives and nobles from Persia, some of whom had long harboured quiet ambitions. One of his brothers, Smerdis, or Bardia, became the subject of paranoid obsession. Convinced his brother posed a threat, Cambyses ordered his secret execution, concealing the death from the court. But concealment only fed the fire. In his absence, a usurper arose claiming to be Smerdis, leading a revolt that would unravel Cambyses' fragile hold on the empire. News of the rebellion reached Cambyses while he was still in Egypt. Enraged, he set out to return to Persia, but fate had one final cruelty in store. As he mounted his horse, his sword slipped from its sheath and cut his thigh, the same leg, it is said, that he had earlier used to mock the gods of Memphis. the wound festered. Within weeks, Cambyses was dead, his body left without ceremony in a foreign land whose people cursed his name. To the Egyptians, his death was a divine reckoning. They remembered him not as a king, but as a blight, a figure whose reign symbolized the depths of sacrilege and tyranny. Though some in Persia would later attempt to portray him as a just ruler, in Egypt his memory was etched in grief and defiance. In the wake of his death, confusion reigned, the empire teetered, and Egypt dared to hope, if only briefly, that freedom might return. But the wheel of history turned ever onward, and another Persian king soon claimed the land. Darius I, the great organizer, the architect of roads and law, but also a man who viewed Egypt not as a sovereign land, but as a satrapy, a province to be taxed, controlled and reshaped. Under Darius, Egypt was bound tighter still. He restored some temples, not out of piety, but to curry favour. He codified laws, not to uplift the people, but to enforce obedience. Yet compared to Cambyses, his reign seemed almost merciful, a cold bureaucracy replacing wildfire cruelty. Still, the memory of Cambyses lingered. The people did not forget the laughter echoing in the temple as the bull fell. They did not forget the priest's robes torn as tribute was seized. Nor did they forget the silence that followed his death, a silence filled with mourning and, just beneath, smouldering rage. For cruelty, once introduced, leaves behind not just scars but seeds. Seeds that lie dormant until the right moment, the right king, the right fire. Egypt would endure many more rulers, many more invaders, and many more masks of peace. But the cruelty of Cambyses would remain unmatched in its contempt, not just for people, but for the gods themselves. The Nile, ever watching, carried the stories downriver, past shattered shrines and broken idols, and somewhere beneath the silt and shadow, the memory of Egypt waited, not to forget, but to endure. The years passed as if in mourning, each flood of the Nile washing over the remnants of a broken sovereignty. Egypt remained, but only in the way that a statue remains after its features have been worn smooth by time. Beneath the rule of Persia, it became a vassal of empire, its wealth drained to gild distant thrones, its gods honoured only when politically convenient. And yet the old spirit had not vanished. It slumbered in temple shadows, in the quiet rhythm of rituals still performed in secret, in the hearts of men who remembered a time before foreign boots stamped their path across sacred soil. The Achaemenid rule tightened under Darius I, who was less a tyrant than a tactician. His administration of Egypt was precise, efficient, even progressive by the standards of the day. He restored temples, funded canals, and respected native customs, but always with the caveat that every gesture served his greater empire. He was a pharaoh in title only, his gaze fixed not on Memphis or Thebes, but on Persepolis. Even so, his rule was bearable, and many Egyptians resigned themselves to this new order. But where Darius was methodical, his son Xerxes was less so, and it is with him that our tale of cruelty resumes, like a sharp breath after uneasy silence. Xerxes ascended the Persian throne in a blaze of imperial ambition. While the ruins of his father's project still echoed with chisels and hammers, he turned his attention westward, to Greece, to glory, and to vengeance. Egypt for him was merely a stepping stone, a resource, a jewel to fund his campaign across the Aegean. And when whispers of rebellion stirred in the Delta, Xerxes responded not with diplomacy, but with fire. In the year 486 BCE, a rebellion flared. Egyptian nobles, perhaps emboldened by the change of ruler, rose in protest, attempting to shake free from the yoke of foreign dominion. Xerxes crushed them without hesitation. His army marched south, razing villages and temples along the way. Entire families were executed for the crimes of their lords. Thebes, ancient and sacred, was occupied with an iron presence. What made Xerxes' response so bitterly memorable was not merely the violence, but the message it sent. Upon regaining control, he stripped Egypt of its privileges. Temples were no longer funded. The priesthood of Amun, long the spiritual heart of the land, was cast into poverty. Religious autonomy, once cautiously preserved under Darius, was revoked. The sacred bark of the gods no longer sailed during festivals. The gods themselves, it seemed, had been silenced. Xerxes installed satraps who ruled with cruelty and contempt, some of whom could not speak the Egyptian tongue, nor cared to learn. Taxes increased. Artisans were conscripted into imperial projects. The skilled hands that once shaped golden funerary masks now moulded bricks for foreign citadels. And all the while, the image of Xerxes was cast in stone, not as a pharaoh, but as the king of kings. Tall, aloof, detached from the traditions he had extinguished, the people remembered. They remembered the ceremonies no longer performed, the fields abandoned, the voices of the gods growing fainter by the year. Xerxes, though physically distant, had become a name associated with desecration, with the severing of Egypt from itself. And yet, like so many rulers intoxicated by empire, Xerxes fell not at the hands of his conquered, but from within. He was assassinated by one of his own court officials, a fate shared by many whose cruelty robs them of loyalty. The Persian court moved on. Egypt did not. But peace did not follow. The throne passed to Artaxerxes I and then to Darius II, and with each successor came further distance. Egypt was no longer ruled by pharaohs who walked among the people, but by kings whose faces were unfamiliar, whose names were unpronounceable, whose only language was command. The administration grew heavier, the tribute more demanding, the hope of freedom dimmer. Until, at last, rebellion returned. Not as a whisper this time, but as a roar. In the 5th century BCE, Egypt seized a moment of weakness in Persia's western campaigns and broke its chains. A native prince, Amatius of Sais, rose with the support of both the priesthood and the army. His revolt was swift and effective, aided by Greek mercenaries who had grown weary of Persian overreach. He declared himself pharaoh, the first native Egyptian to rule in over a century. Amatius's reign was short, a mere 6 years, but it cracked the stone mask of empire. Egypt would not be silenced so easily again. Following him came a string of native rulers, each clawing back fragments of sovereignty. Nepherites, Hakor, and others whose names are less known to the world but carved deeply into Egypt's will to endure. Among these, one ruler stands out, not for cruelty in the typical sense, but for the cold relentlessness with which he defended what little remained of independence, Nectanebo I. A military man, Nectanebo was no idealist. He knew the strength of Persia, the weight of its army, and the long reach of its ambition, so he prepared Egypt like a fortress. Fortifications were raised across the delta. The army was restructured and alliances were formed with Greek city-states eager to trouble Persia's western flank. Yet Nectanebo's strength came with harshness. He imposed strict control over religious discourse, ensuring the temples remained aligned with the state. Dissent, even from the priesthood, was swiftly punished. Those suspected of collaboration with Persian agents were tried in secret courts, often sentenced without the chance to defend themselves. Still, he was seen by many as a protector, the last great native pharaoh. For a time, Egypt knew stability, even pride. Temples were restored, art flourished once more, the Nile festivals resumed, and the gods returned to their processions. But shadows loomed. Persia had not forgotten, and its vengeance would come not through battle but through betrayal. A war not of armies, but of trust. Nectanebo's sun would fall, the last pharaohs would scatter, and once more Egypt would be subsumed, this time by a force even the gods could not foresee. A young Macedonian king with lion's eyes and lightning in his step, his name was Alexander. But before his arrival, Egypt would suffer one final cruel return to Persian rule, one last echo of the ancient wound reopened. It would come with Artaxerxes III, and with him the cruelty would return not only in command but in flame. The old gods had returned to their temples, if only for a moment. Under Nectanebo Wurs, Egypt had breathed as Egypt again, its rites performed in full, its soil tilled by hands not bowed to a foreign king. Yet the sands of the two lands are ever shifting, and the Nile, eternal as it seems, cannot hold back the tide forever. As the 30th dynasty rose and fell with desperate courage, the empire to the east, Persia, prepared its final march. Artaxerxes III, a name once uttered in distant courts and distant tongues, now drew close. Where his predecessors had ruled Egypt as absentee kings, content to let satraps enforce tribute and policy, Artaxerxes would not be so gentle. He came not simply to govern, but to punish. It was 343 BCE when he launched his campaign. Egypt, now ruled by Nectanebo II, grandson of the first, stood defiant. Nectanebo had fortified the land, raised a formidable army of native soldiers and foreign mercenaries, and renewed the spiritual strength of the kingdom. Yet the Persians came in overwhelming force, thousands strong, led by generals hardened by years of conquest, supported by fleets from Phoenicia and Cyprus. Treachery, too, played its part. Greek mercenaries, once loyal to Egypt, had shifted sides, selling their swords to the highest bidder. The war was brutal. Egypt's border fortresses crumbled under relentless siege. At Pelusium, once the gate of resistance, the defence collapsed. Nectanebo retreated southward, seeking refuge among the Theban priesthood. But the gods gave no answer, and the people, exhausted, terrified, could not hold. He fled, slipping into the shadows of Nubia, his fate unknown. Some say he died in exile. Others say he wandered the desert, a ghost king beneath the stars. With Egypt fallen, Artaxerxes III did what Cambyses had done a century before, but with greater malice and colder intent. The conquest was not merely military. It was cultural, spiritual, total. Temples were looted, their treasuries emptied to fund further campaigns. Gold and silver were stripped from the altars of Ammon, Horus and Isis. Sacred texts were taken, burned or carried off to Persian cities. Statues of the gods were toppled and defiled, their faces chiselled away in a calculated erasure of divine protection. The oracle of Siwa, long a symbol of spiritual sovereignty, was silenced. But Artaxerxes' cruelty did not stop at symbols. It reached into the marrow of Egypt's daily life. High priests were dragged from sanctuaries and publicly humiliated. Some were executed as collaborators. Others were forced into exile, their temples handed over to Persian-appointed stewards who spoke no Egyptian, knew no rights, and cared only for gold. In one infamous episode, Artaxerxes reportedly ordered the sacred Apis bull, a calf believed to be a living god, to be killed again, echoing Cambyses' defilement. Whether fact or fabrication, the tale passed from mouth to mouth, each telling a little sharper, a little darker. What mattered was not the truth, but the fear. And fear now ruled. To prevent future rebellion, Artaxerxes dismantled Egypt's native army, disbanding regiments and exiling officers. Many of them were never seen again. Some were sold into slavery in eastern provinces, others were simply erased. Children of noble families were taken as hostages, raised far from home to ensure the obedience of their parents. He did not style himself as a pharaoh, though coins bore Egyptian symbols and some temples still performed rites in his name. There was no illusion of sacred kingship. Artaxerxes was a conqueror and Egypt was his prize. What he did not destroy outright, he suffocated. The scribes of the temple archives, once the keepers of millennia, began to vanish. Their ink faded. Their styluses were laid to rest in stone boxes. The number of hieroglyphic inscriptions dropped sharply, as if the language itself had lost the will to speak. Taxes rose beyond endurance. The fields of the Delta, once green and generous, grew fallow under the weight of tribute. The common people suffered in silence, their protests unheard beneath the grinding mechanisms of imperial rule. Artisans, farmers, boatmen, those who once sustained the heartbeat of the Nile, now laboured for masters who saw them only as units of productivity. And yet, for all his victories, Artaxerxes remained a man of flesh and flaw. In his final years, paranoia took root. He distrusted his generals, his satraps, even his family. One by one, those closest to him were imprisoned or executed. The empire he had built trembled under the weight of its own suspicion. He died suddenly in 338 BCE, poisoned, some say, by his own courtiers. His successor, Arses, reigned for only a brief, chaotic moment before being overthrown by Darius III. But Egypt, weary, battered, drained, did not rise again. The last ember of native resistance had burned out. The old gods no longer walked the land in procession. The temples stood quiet, the tombs unopened. And so, in that silence, the wind shifted once more, this time from the west. Not Persian, not Egyptian, but something new. A young king had crossed the Hellespont, a man raised not among the papyri and pylons of the Nile, but among marble colonnades and the sharp discourse of philosophers. He had tamed the Balkans, burned Thebes, and dared to call himself son of Zeus. His name was Alexander, and Egypt would become not his conquest, but his stage. But before Alexander arrived, Egypt would remember. It would grieve what had been lost. Not just its kings, its temples, its freedom, but its identity. That grief, silent though it was, would shape how the land received its new master, not as a saviour, not as a tyrant, but as a stranger stepping into the ruins of gods. By the time Alexander the Great reached the sun-bleached sands of Egypt in 332 BCE, the land was more shadow than kingdom. The tombs of old kings lay quiet beneath their dunes. The temples of the gods still stood, but their chants had thinned into ritualized echoes, and the people, bowed under 2 centuries of foreign rule, watched the horizon with weary eyes. They had seen many conquerors. Most had brought suffering, some had brought ruin. Now came one more. But Alexander was different, not in the strength of his army or the ambition that burned behind his eyes, but in how he chose to enter Egypt. Unlike Cambyses or Artaxerxes, he did not arrive as a defiler. He came as a guest, invited not by royal decree, but by the collective exhaustion of a people who no longer had the will to resist. The Persian satrap Mazaces offered no defence. No armies stood against the Macedonian tide. The gates of the cities opened. The Nile flowed untroubled. Alexander, wise beyond his years in the theatre of empire, understood the moment. He made no grand display of conquest, no mockery of the gods. Instead, he walked humbly into Memphis, allowed the priests to anoint him in the traditions of old, and paid homage to the pantheon that his predecessors had desecrated. He offered sacrifices to Apis. He consulted the oracle of Amun at Siwa, crossing the desert to seek divine legitimacy. Legend says the priests there declared him the son of Amun, a living god. Whether he believed it or not, Alexander allowed the tale to grow. He had no need to impose himself on Egypt. The land, tired and fractured, wrapped itself around him like a memory longing to be rekindled. In Alexandria, the city that would bear his name, he laid the foundation for a new era. It was not built atop the ruins of Egypt, but beside them. Greek columns would rise beside obelisks. The language of Homer would echo through halls that still bore the scent of lotus and incense. For the first time in centuries, Egypt was not forced to forget itself in order to survive. It was simply asked to wait. Yet even as Alexander showed reverence, there remained an undercurrent of quiet dominance. His rule was gentle only in comparison to the horrors that had come before. He installed Greek officials to oversee administration. He levied taxes. He ensured that power flowed toward Macedon. But he understood the value of appearances. And so the temples flourished once more. The gods were honoured and Egypt exhaled, if only briefly. Alexander did not remain long. His eyes turned eastward toward Persia, where Darius III still clung to the throne of an empire that had once swallowed Egypt whole. He marched on Babylon, on Susa, on Persepolis, burning the palaces of his enemies and claiming their crown. Egypt faded into the backdrop of his conquests, a jewel won early, admired briefly, and then tucked away. He would never return. When news of his death reached Egypt in 323 BCE, carried on the desert wind like a storm long foretold, there was no uprising, no celebration. The people had learned over centuries that rulers came and went, but the Nile endured. Yet something had shifted. For the first time in generations, the question of who would rule Egypt was not answered in distant capitals, but in Alexandria itself. One of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy, a man of both shrewd mind and cautious ambition, moved quickly. He claimed Egypt as his satrapy, then as his kingdom. While the other successors of Alexander tore the empire to pieces, Ptolemy fortified Egypt, presented himself as pharaoh, and married Greek governance with Egyptian ritual. And thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a rule that would last nearly 3 centuries, through both prosperity and peril, wisdom and wickedness. It was an era of immense cultural fusion. The Library of Alexandria rose, harbouring the knowledge of many worlds. Trade flourished, science and philosophy found a new home. But the cruelty of kings did not vanish with Persian exile. It merely changed its form, for not all Ptolemies were as measured as the first. Power, once consolidated, bred suspicion. And in a court where bloodlines mingled too closely, where brother married sister and alliances turned on a single word, cruelty became not an exception, but a necessity. One ruler among them, Ptolemy VIII, later nicknamed Physcon, or the Bloated, would rule with such vindictiveness that even the old pharaohs might have turned away in discomfort. His reign, generations after Alexander, would mirror the paranoia of Cambyses, the purges of Artaxerxes, and the duplicity of Apries, but with a theatricality all his own. He began his rule with promise, but it was a promise quickly broken. He exiled his rivals, then recalled them, only to execute them publicly. He betrayed temples, slaughtered scholars, and turned Alexandria's streets red with blood. It is said that in a single purge he ordered the death of hundreds, philosophers, poets, priests, whose only crime was to question his whims. His own family did not escape. He married his sister Cleopatra II, then took her daughter, Cleopatra III, as his second wife. When the two women turned against him, he responded with monstrous violence, executing his own son and sending the boy's dismembered remains as a gift to the grieving queen. And still, the people endured. Still, the Nile flowed. For Egypt had become something older and wiser than any single ruler. It absorbed cruelty like the desert absorbs heat, silently, deeply, without protest. But it never forgot. And each injustice left an impression carved into memory like a name into limestone. As the Ptolemaic dynasty continued, veering between grandeur and madness, another storm gathered across the sea, not Persian this time, nor Macedonian, but Roman. The final chapter of Egypt's independence would come not with war, but with seduction, betrayal, and the fall of a queen. But before Cleopatra VII would stand before Caesar and Antony, before Rome's eagles soared above the Nile, the story of cruelty still had one more king to tell, one more tyrant in whose reign Egypt would again tremble. That man was Ptolemy X, and in him ambition would burn bright and destroy everything it touched. The flickering oil lamps of Alexandria burned late into the night, casting golden light upon marble colonnades and basalt statues. In the courtyards, the scent of myrrh lingered beneath the perfume of foreign blooms, carried in from lands as distant as India and Gaul. The city, jewel of the Mediterranean, wore its beauty like a mask. Behind that mask, however, the dynasty of the Ptolemies had grown brittle, its harmony frayed by intrigue, jealousy, and blood. And from within this increasingly fragile house of kings rose Ptolemy X, a ruler both born to power and consumed by it. He was known formally as Ptolemy Alexander I, but in the corners of temples and the back rooms of the agora, another name was spoken in hushed tones: the usurper. For his path to the throne was paved not by merit nor by the will of the gods, but by betrayal, exile, and calculated cruelty. His early years were marked by displacement. The court was divided. His mother, Cleopatra III, favoured him over his elder brother, Ptolemy IX. Yet when power shifted like sand in a jar, Ptolemy X found himself driven from Alexandria, forced to seek shelter in distant Cyprus. There, among exiles and mercenaries, he waited, and when the moment came, when his mother summoned him back to Egypt to depose his brother, he returned not as a son, but as a weapon. Upon his return, he ruled alongside Cleopatra III, but it was a delicate arrangement. His mother's hand was ever on the lever of control. Though she had raised him, protected him, and delivered him the crown, Ptolemy X chafed under her authority. He saw shadows in every hallway, whispers in every chamber, and soon he acted. In an act that shocked even a city as accustomed to treachery as Alexandria, he had Cleopatra III murdered, his own mother, the woman who had shaped his destiny. The pretense was thin, the justifications thinner. Her name was struck from certain records. Statues were quietly moved from temples. But the people knew, they always knew. With her death, Ptolemy X assumed sole control. His reign, though brief in comparison to others, left wounds deep and lasting. To secure his throne, he emptied the royal treasury, selling off heirlooms, sacred relics, even parts of the temple estates. The golden sarcophagi of earlier pharaohs were stripped of their inlays. Precious scrolls vanished from the Library of Alexandria, sold to foreign collectors and emissaries in exchange for short-lived alliances. He conscripted young men from the countryside, not for national defence, but to guard the palace, a paranoid bulwark against his own people. Farmers were taxed until their lands lay fallow. Priests who refused to sing hymns in his name were exiled or worse. One account tells of a high priest from Heliopolis who was arrested in the midst of festival rites and vanished beneath the vaults of the Serapeum. His replacement, appointed by the king himself, was a man with no training in the sacred arts, but a long record of loyalty to the court. Even the visual culture of Egypt began to suffer. Temples completed under his rule bore his likeness with disproportionate grandeur, his face carved larger than gods beside him, his titles inscribed with boastful exaggeration. And yet, for all his vanity, he was never secure. His advisors changed often, his generals even more so. Assassination plots, real and imagined, haunted his sleep. It was not just his own people he alienated. Foreign allies turned cold. His treatment of sacred institutions appalled both native Egyptians and Greek elites. Rome, already rising in the west, looked upon the Ptolemaic court with growing disdain, seeing in Ptolemy Kex a ruler whose instability might soon invite collapse or intervention. Eventually the tide turned. The citizens of Alexandria, stirred by famine, corruption and humiliation, rose against him. His palaces were pelted with stones, his proclamations were torn from public walls. Faced with open rebellion, he fled once again. This time not as an exile with potential, but as a king whose crown had slipped beyond his reach. He attempted to return, but the city barred its gates. The army, once loyal, refused to march, and so he died not as a pharaoh, nor as a son, nor even as a ruler in exile. He died in Cyprus, the island of his youth, surrounded by debts and regrets. His body was returned to Egypt under uncertain circumstances. Some say it was buried in a modest tomb, denied the splendour of a king's farewell. Others claim it was lost at sea, devoured by the very waves that had carried him between glory and ruin. In the years that followed, Egypt continued its downward spiral. One ruler replaced another in hurried succession. Civil war simmered just below the surface. The temples grew quieter, the grain ships fewer. The people endured, as they always had, but the kingdom that had once stood as the beacon of the ancient world now flickered like a flame in wind. Yet the story of Egypt's cruelest pharaohs was not quite complete. One final act remained. One more sovereign who would hold the world's gaze not through conquest or terror, but through charm, wit, and the shifting currents of empire. She would be remembered not for the lives she took, but for those she enthralled. Not for violence, but for the tremors she caused in the hearts of generals, consuls, and emperors. Her name was Cleopatra, and hers would be the last voice of a royal Egypt that had outlived gods and empires, only to fall at the feet of Rome. The land of Egypt, weathered by centuries of conquest and courtly betrayal, had grown used to the silence between great voices. Its monuments still stood, cracked and wind-scoured but enduring, while the Nile flowed as it always had, unbothered by the ambitions of men. And then, in the dying breath of a dynasty, came a queen whose voice would echo across the marble forums of Rome and down through the long corridors of history. Cleopatra VII, the final Ptolemy, the last true pharaoh. She was born into a court trembling with intrigue, a house of mirrors where family feuds were measured not in words but in poison, exile and dagger thrusts beneath golden drapes. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was a weak and self-indulgent man, remembered more for his musical talents than his policies. He had bought Roman favour to secure his throne, plunging Egypt deep into debt while losing the trust of his own people. When he was briefly exiled, Cleopatra, barely a girl, watched the city shift its loyalties like the tide, and she learned then that survival would require more than titles. When her father returned to power with Roman support, he began grooming her to rule, favouring her over his other children. Unlike her predecessors, Cleopatra learned the Egyptian language, embraced native customs, and studied history with devotion. She was not content to be a queen in name alone. She would be Egypt itself, wrapped in linen, armed with silver, and breathing the perfume of lotus and strategy. When Ptolemy XII died, Cleopatra ascended the throne alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as custom dictated. But power was not meant to be shared, and in Alexandria's crowded halls, whispers swirled once more. The advisors of her brother, fearful of Cleopatra's influence and intelligence, manoeuvred to cast her out. She was forced into exile, fleeing with a few loyal retainers while her brother claimed sole authority. But Cleopatra did not disappear. She waited. Rome, the new master of the Mediterranean, was embroiled in its own civil wars. Julius Caesar, chasing his rival Pompey across the sea, arrived in Alexandria at the precise moment Egypt stood on the edge of internal conflict. Cleopatra saw in this moment not only opportunity, but destiny. Legend paints the scene as a tale of seduction. Cleopatra arriving wrapped in a rug, unfurled before Caesar like a gift. Yet the truth was more cunning. She brought with her not beauty alone, but wit, intellect, and an understanding of power that transcended the gilded trappings of her lineage. Caesar, no fool, saw in her a partner of consequence. With his support, Cleopatra returned to the palace. Civil war erupted between her and her brother. The famed Library of Alexandria, so long a repository of wisdom, caught fire during the chaos. And when the ash settled, Ptolemy XIII was dead, drowned, it is said, in the Nile as he fled the battle. Cleopatra was queen once more. Her rule was not marked by immediate cruelty, but by the burdens of a crumbling kingdom and the looming shadow of Rome. She knew that Egypt could not stand alone, so she did what no pharaoh before her had ever done. She placed her crown upon Caesar's legacy. From their union came a child, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra declared co-ruler and heir to both Egypt and, by extension, the might of Rome. But such claims stirred unease across the sea. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE left her vulnerable once again, and the tides of fortune began to turn. Into this storm stepped Mark Antony, a general of renown, heir to Caesar's ambitions, and a man whose destiny had not yet been written. Their meeting was orchestrated like a divine play. Cleopatra arriving on a golden barge, sails billowing, musicians playing, the queen dressed as Isis incarnate. Whether the performance was for him or for the watching gods, none could say. They became lovers, rulers and allies. Their union was not simply of passion, but of politics. Together they imagined an empire stretching from the sands of Egypt to the palaces of Asia Minor. Cleopatra bore him children. Together they proclaimed a new order, the donations of Alexandria, wherein Caesarion would be king of kings, and their children would inherit kingdoms carved from Rome's eastern territories. But Rome, ever suspicious, ever hungry, saw in Cleopatra not a queen, but a threat. Octavian, the future Augustus, painted her as a sorceress, a foreign seductress who had turned noble Antony into a traitor. She was vilified in verse and speech, accused of corrupting the Roman soul with Eastern decadence. And when Antony defied the Senate, sailing to war at Cleopatra's side, the stage was set for the final tragedy. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE was no simple clash of arms. It was the end of an age. Antony and Cleopatra's forces, though formidable, were defeated in a decisive naval engagement. Their retreat marked the unravelling of all they had built. Back in Egypt, as Octavian advanced, Cleopatra prepared her tomb, a mausoleum of alabaster and gold, filled with offerings to ensure her passage into the afterlife. Her death, when it came, was as calculated as her life. Whether by asp, blade or hidden poison, she chose her end. Antony fell upon his sword and died in her arms. Cleopatra followed soon after. Caesarion, the last hope of native pharaonic blood, was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. The child who was born of gods and emperors perished quietly, and with him Egypt's line of kings. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt ceased to be a kingdom. It became a province. The temples remained, and the Nile still flowed, but the land had fallen forever under foreign rule. The cruelty of Cleopatra's story lies not in bloodshed or tyranny. Hers was a cruelty born of inevitability, the slow suffocation of sovereignty, the tightening grip of empire, the impossibility of preserving a civilization that had lasted longer than any Rome could yet imagine. She had tried to save it with diplomacy, with alliance, with beauty and brilliance and war. But in the end, Egypt bowed not to gods or kings, but to the cold march of history. The age of pharaohs was over, and in its place stood marble statues, Latin inscriptions, and legions where once there had been lotus, linen, and light. With the passing of Cleopatra, the sun set not just on a reign, but on an entire civilization. Egypt, the land of obelisks and oracles, of hieroglyphs carved into eternity, became Rome's to command. The eagle replaced the uraeus. The measured tones of Egyptian priests gave way to Latin decrees. And where once pharaohs walked as gods, now governors walked as men, appointed from distant lands to oversee grain, taxes and obedience. Yet even in subjugation, Egypt remained a treasure too valuable to ignore. Its Nile still swelled with life. Its temples still stood, cracked, defaced, but not destroyed. And in those sanctuaries, far from the marble courts of Rome, the last keepers of the old faith whispered ancient prayers in corners untouched by empire. It was within this delicate balance between memory and control that Rome ruled Egypt. For the next 3 centuries, the land was held as an imperial prize. Its wealth funneled northward, its identity slowly diluted by generations of external command. But as with all empires, what begins with consolidation often ends in cruelty. And though the name of Pharaoh was no longer spoken in court, the weight of tyranny would still press down upon Egypt. Not through divinity claimed, but through indifference wielded like a blade. Among the Roman prefects assigned to govern Egypt, few matched the shadow cast by Gaius alias Gallus, a man whose name survives only faintly in the records, but whose actions marked the beginning of a long tradition of apathy, masked as rule. Gallus, appointed by Augustus himself, was sent not just to administer but to explore. Rome hungered for more gold, more land, more dominance. The province of Egypt, despite its riches, was seen as a gateway to Arabia, and Gallus was chosen to pierce that veil. With 10,000 men, he set off on a campaign into the Arabian Peninsula, claiming it would be swift, fruitful and glorious. But the journey was poorly planned, lacking knowledge of terrain, climate and resistance. For months, the soldiers suffered, not from battle, but from disease, thirst and the endless sun. Entire cohorts perished in the desert, their bones left bleaching beside shattered carts and empty waterskins. When Gallus returned, defeated and ashamed, his silence said more than any report. Yet while Rome forgave his failure, Egypt did not. His absence had left the province in disarray. Grain shipments stalled, banditry increased in the south, temples reported looting by local garrisons, and the people, whose labour sustained Rome's growing hunger, were punished with increased levies to make up for lost tribute. This was the new cruelty, not one of fire and sword, but of neglect, of rulers who neither knew nor cared for the rhythms of the Nile, who came, collected, and departed without learning a single name from the land they governed. Under Tiberius, Caligula and Nero, Egypt became increasingly fragile. The once protected grain routes grew dangerous. Governors tightened their grip, not to serve justice, but to preserve order. Rebellions, when they sparked, were crushed swiftly and without mercy. One account from Upper Egypt tells of a village that refused to pay its grain quota during a drought. Roman soldiers arrived, killed the village elders, and set fire to the granaries, leaving the people to starve in silence. And yet, even within these acts of brutality, the memory of Egypt endured. The temples of Dendera and Philae still welcomed pilgrims. Priests still recited hymns to Isis and Horus, though fewer voices joined them each year. The hieroglyphic script, carved in devotion for 3,000 years, began to falter, replaced by Greek cursive in the north and by Latin accounts written for governors who never read them. In the 2nd century CE, another blow came, quiet but irreversible. The worship of Roman emperors was formally introduced into Egyptian temples. Statues of Augustus, then Hadrian, then Marcus Aurelius were placed alongside the gods. Rituals were adapted. Offerings once made to Osiris were now shared with Caesar. In these acts, Rome sought not to destroy Egyptian identity, but to absorb it, to tame its divinity and recast it as pageantry. One Roman governor, Aemilius Rectus, famously declared in a letter to the emperor, "The temples here are quiet, the priests docile, the people obedient, Egypt is at peace." But peace in this case meant the absence of resistance, not the presence of prosperity. Beneath the silence, something vital was fading. The gods, once bright with presence, now seemed distant. Their shrines, once living, now echoed with empty rites. Even in Alexandria, once the crown of learning, the decline was palpable. The famed library had long suffered neglect and fire. Scholars left or were silenced. The lighthouse, that great marvel, still stood, but its flame no longer guided philosophy, only ships bearing wheat and wine to Roman ports. And then came the final stroke. In the 3rd century CE, under the weight of internal strife and external pressure, the Roman Empire began to fracture. Egypt, caught between emperors and usurpers, became a battleground. Famine returned. The temples, already poor, could no longer afford the rituals that had defined them. In Thebes, a sanctuary to Ammon was repurposed as a Roman barracks. In Memphis, the last known high priest died without a successor. When Diocletian rose to power, he sought to restore order with one final devastating reform. He issued edicts that purged Egypt's ancient priesthoods and repurposed temple lands for the state. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, carved into a wall at Philae, dates to 394 CE, a simple prayer, barely a whisper in stone. After that, silence. The cruelty that ended Egypt's sacred age was not sudden, not brutal in the way of Cambyses or Artaxerxes. It was slower, quieter, a long forgetting, each stone left uncarved, each god left unnamed, each rite abandoned, not by force but by fading. The old Egypt of Narmer and Khufu, of Hatshepsut and Ramses, was no more. and though her memory would live on in ruins, in scrolls and in dreams, she would never again rise as a sovereign power. The pharaohs were gone. Their cruelty, vast, many-faced, had left deep scars. But so too had the cruelty of those who came after. Conquerors who ruled without understanding, emperors who demanded only tribute, and governors who saw in the Nile not a spirit, but a commodity, and still, even in ruin, the Nile flowed. The Nile wound its ancient path beneath a sky emptied of divine names. The papyrus thicket still whispered in the wind, and the ibis still waded through the shallows. But the world around them had changed beyond recognition. Egypt, once the cradle of 1,000 gods, now bore the weight of a single empire, and in time even that would fracture and fall. When Rome splintered into East and West, Egypt passed into the hands of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople, a city of domes and mosaics far removed from the carved temples of Karnak or the sun-bathed columns of Luxor. From this distance, Egypt was no longer a land of mystery or majesty. It was a province, a line in an imperial ledger, a source of grain and coin. Christianity had begun to spread centuries before, whispered among the slaves, the poor, the disillusioned. It arrived not as a flood, but as a slow tide. The ancient gods, once thunderous in their dominion, watched helplessly as their temples emptied, their images defaced, their festivals outlawed. In the age of Constantine and his successors, the cross began to replace the ankh, and the name of Christ was uttered where once priests had called out to Ra. At first, the shift was quiet, one god joining others in the great mosaic of Egyptian belief. But as the new faith gained imperial favour, its message sharpened. The old gods were not just forgotten, they were condemned. Their priests were called deceivers, their statues demons in stone, and so began the final dismantling of Egypt's sacred identity. Not by invaders from afar, but by converts within. Temples were converted into churches or left to collapse. The grand edifice of the Serapeum in Alexandria, once a beacon of divine knowledge and a monument to the syncretism of Greek and Egyptian belief, was destroyed in 391 CE, its libraries scattered, its idols broken. Bishop Theophilus, leading a Christian mob, sanctioned the destruction. Stone by stone, Egypt's last great temple fell. The people watched in silence, some mourning, some rejoicing, all knowing that an age had ended. The ancient script, hieroglyphic, elegant and intricate, had already faded. Its last known use, etched onto the walls of Philly, was a relic even as it was written. Those who could read it were gone. The knowledge passed not to sons or apprentices, but to the silence of stone. A language of gods became mute. The cruelty of this era was more complex, more intimate. It did not come with the roar of armies, but with the erosion of identity. It severed memory from practice, heritage from belief. Children grew up never hearing the names of Osiris or Bastet, the myths that once explained the rising sun, the changing seasons, the path of the soul after death. All were swept away by sermons and scriptural admonitions. Where once the journey through the Duat was carved in coffins and tomb walls, now salvation lay not in spells and offerings, but in sacraments and confessions. And yet the land endured. In the far south, at Philae, a small band of priests held the line for decades. The temple to Isis, mother of magic, continued to receive offerings well into the 6th century. Nubian kings and queens made pilgrimages there, clinging to the last strands of a faith too ancient to forget. They chanted the old hymns, recited the old prayers, but fewer and fewer came. The priests aged, the scrolls grew brittle, the sacred lake dried in the sun. Finally, in the reign of Emperor Justinian, a general was dispatched to close the temple forever. The gates were barred, the images of Isis, Horus and Osiris were chipped away, the priests were dispersed, and the last echo of Egypt's spiritual sovereignty faded into silence. After that, Egypt became a land of memory. Its people were Christians now, not in secret, but in law. Churches rose from stones once consecrated to Amun. Monks walked the deserts where prophets once meditated beneath obelisks. The Coptic church grew, rooted in Egyptian soil but branching toward a different heaven. Yet, the peace was brief. In 641 CE, another force arrived, swift, determined, bearing the banner of a new revelation. The Arab armies of Islam swept across North Africa and into the Nile Valley, meeting little resistance. The Byzantine governor fled, the cities opened their gates. Egypt, ever patient, submitted again. The new rulers brought not destruction but transformation. Islam, like Christianity before it, absorbed what it found, reshaping, reinterpreting. The old gods were long gone by then, their temples abandoned, their names unknown to the conquerors. But the Nile remained. The cycles of planting and harvest continued. The people, as always, adapted. Arabic replaced Greek and Coptic. New cities were founded, Fustat, Cairo, and new forms of architecture rose from the desert, crowned with domes and minarets. Egypt flourished once more, a jewel in the Umayyad and Abbasid crowns. Scholars came, merchants thrived, and the call to prayer echoed where once hymns to Ra had risen with the dawn. But the old stories, the ones carved deep into the bones of the land, did not disappear entirely. They lingered in the shapes of amulets, in the curves of certain words, in the hush of the wind through temple ruins. The cruelty of history had buried them, but not erased them. Memory lives in more than language. It lives in rhythm, gesture, the turning of a head toward the sun. By the time the French and British came with their curiosity and cannon, Egypt had forgotten the meanings of the hieroglyphs etched into its walls. It took a broken slab of stone, the Rosetta Stone, to begin unlocking the language again. Scholars deciphered the signs, traced the lines, read the names aloud for the first time in over 1,000 years. Narmer, Jer, Khufu, Hatshepsut, Ramses, Akhenaten, Cleopatra. In rediscovery, there was a kind of rebirth, but also a melancholy for what had once lived in belief now lived only in books and museums. The gods did not return, the pharaohs did not rise from their tombs, the cruelty of their rule, their vanity, their splendour, all had become echoes. And yet, in every cracked stone and painted sarcophagus, they whispered still. The centuries slipped by like reeds in the current, bent, broken, drifting. The Egypt of gods and gold had become the Egypt of memory, of sand-laced wind moving through hollow temples and broken pylons. Its story, once told in ceremonies and incense, now survived in parchment and silence, but the echoes endured. Long after the priests of Karnak had fallen silent, after the gods had been packed away in stone and dust, travellers still came. They stood in awe before the great statues, gazing up into the eyes of kings who had ruled before Rome was a whisper. By the 19th century, a new kind of visitor arrived. Not conquerors, not entirely, but seekers. European explorers, scholars and soldiers found themselves drawn to the Nile, to its banks of history layered like sediment. They came with notebooks, sketch pads and chisels, and with them came the second unmaking of Egypt, one done not by sword or law, but by possession. The ruins of the ancient world were no longer seen as sacred remnants. They became trophies. Columns and statues were hauled away on ships bound for Paris and London. Sarcophagi, gold inlaid and covered in divine script, were boxed and sold. Mummies were unwrapped before dinner parties, their bones examined and dismissed, their wrappings kept as curiosities. Entire tombs were emptied, their treasures scattered across the drawing rooms of Europe. In these acts, clothed in curiosity, cloaked in scholarship, lay a cruelty of another sort, the theft of reverence. Even in rediscovery, Egypt was not allowed to speak for itself. Its stories were retold by foreign tongues, its gods renamed, its kings recast. Ramses became Ozymandias. Akhenaten was no longer heretic, but visionary. Cleopatra, queen, strategist, survivor, was reduced to a romantic figure framed in the light of Rome's gaze. The dignity of the past was softened, remade into spectacle. The great archaeological expeditions that followed were not always acts of pillage. Many were born from genuine wonder, but they still bore the imprint of power. Local Egyptians, whose ancestors had built the tombs and temples, were often excluded from the meaning of their own legacy. They carried the tools, hauled the crates, guarded the sites, but the names carved into academic journals and museum plaques were not theirs. The most famous example of this uneasy revival came in 1922, when Howard Carter, funded by Lord Carnarvon, breached the sealed door of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Behind it lay wonders unseen for 3,000 years, the resting place of Tutankhamun, a boy king whose reign had been nearly forgotten. The world erupted in fascination. Newspapers chronicled every artifact, every rumour. The death mask of the young pharaoh, gold, lapis, obsidian, became the new face of ancient Egypt. But even as light was cast upon the past, the shadow of possession deepened. The tomb became a spectacle. Tutankhamun, once a god king, now stood behind glass, and still deeper layers of cruelty lingered. For every tomb that was excavated, hundreds were looted in haste. For every treasure displayed, others were sold in secret. Ancient scrolls crumbled in foreign air. Ritual objects were misused, mislabeled, or lost. And beneath it all was the quiet, unsettling truth. Egypt's past was no longer hers to keep. The government of modern Egypt, awakening slowly to this reality, began to push back. In the 20th and 21st centuries, efforts were made to reclaim what had been lost. Diplomatic channels were opened. Appeals were made. Some objects returned, others were denied. Museums across the world debated what restitution could mean, what it should look like, and how the past might be honoured after it had been torn into pieces. But no repatriation could return what had been broken, not fully. The context, the continuity, the sacred breath that once animated every statue and wall carving, these could not be reassembled. A god removed from his temple is not a god at all. A mummy displayed beneath fluorescent light cannot complete the journey to the afterlife. The stories of cruelty told in earlier chapters, of Cambyses defiling sacred bulls, of Artaxerxes draining temples, of Ptolemies turning family into enemies, were loud, unmistakable. They left blood on stone, but the cruelty of forgetfulness, of dislocation, of reverent objects turned into curiosities, it was quieter, no less profound. Yet, even now, the soul of Egypt flickers. The locals who guide visitors through the ruins know more than they say. The wind still carries the scent of lotus in spring. And in the deep hours of night, when the tourists are gone and the desert cools beneath a veil of stars, the temples breathe in silence once more. In Luxor, in Abydos, in the deep chambers of Dendera and Edfu, ancient prayers are faintly legible. In them, the pharaohs speak still, not in triumph or cruelty, but in memory. They are no longer gods, they are no longer rulers, they are voices calling out through time. And one day, the sands may settle. The voices may be heard not only through glass and textbook, but in the soft hush of a people remembering not just the grandeur of kings, but the lives they ruled, the burdens they bore, the futures they carved in stone. The cruelty of the pharaohs was real, as was the suffering of their subjects. But now, as the ruins watch the centuries pass, there comes a quiet recognition that all power fades, but remembrance endures. In the waning glow of twilight, the temples of Egypt still rise like the bones of giants caught between worlds. One foot in eternity, the other in decay. Their courtyards are open to the sky now, their columns cracked, their reliefs weathered by time and neglect. Yet they do not crumble entirely. Something holds them up, not mortar or stone, but memory. The story of Egypt's cruelest pharaohs ends not with a single name or final breath, but with the lingering resonance of power used without mercy, of divinity claimed without humility. Their legacies are not measured solely in monuments or gold, but in the silence that followed them, the absence they left behind, the fracture between what was and what could have been. Their cruelty took many forms. Some, like Jer and Khufu, expressed it through ritual and construction, through death bound to afterlife, and monuments fed by toil. Others, like Akhenaten, twisted cruelty into isolation, enforcing worship not through blood, but through neglect of tradition. Still others, Psamtik, Apries, and the later Ptolemies, wielded cruelty through paranoia, turning families and nations against themselves in the name of legacy. And then there were the foreigners, Cambyses, Artaxerxes, and the governors who followed. Their cruelty was cold, distant, and deeply impersonal. They did not seek to understand the land they ruled, only to extract from it. Their ignorance became its own form of violence, stripping temples bare, rewriting rituals, placing foreign faces beside native gods. But cruelty, for all its shadows, also illuminated a deeper truth, that even in suffering the people of Egypt endured, that the Nile still flowed. That faith, though buried and burned, found quiet ways to live on, in the folds of Coptic hymns, in whispered blessings passed between mothers and children, in the rhythm of harvests and funerals, that had not changed since the days when the gods walked among them. Today, the image of the pharaoh is no longer one of dread, but of mystery. He is not feared, but studied. His tomb is no longer sealed in reverence, but opened with reverent curiosity. His legacy, once written in divine decree, now lives in textbooks and documentaries, in museum halls where children peer into glass cases, faces lit by the flickering blue of digital screens. And in these halls, beside the golden masks and granite statues, there remains a question. Quiet, persistent, human. How could those who ruled so high fall so far? Perhaps the answer lies not in their monuments, but in their choices. The greatest cruelty was not the punishment of enemies nor the defilement of temples, but the belief that they themselves were above the world they governed, that the people were tools, that the gods were reflections, that memory itself could be shaped like clay and hardened by decree. But the sands proved otherwise. For now, when we remember Egypt, we do not speak first of fear. We speak of wonder, of beauty, of mystery that humbles. The cruelty, though real, has receded like the floodwaters of the Nile, leaving behind sediment rich in story, fertile for reflection. And perhaps that is the quiet redemption of it all. That those who lived beneath the weight of tyranny, the labourers, the scribes, the weavers and bakers, the nameless thousands, now share the same immortal space as their kings. Their fingerprints remain in bricks and baskets, their laughter and lament echo in walls that no longer hear commands. In the tomb of Ramses III, who died under the weight of conspiracy, the painted ceiling still shows stars. They shine in lapis and gold, eternal and unblinking. And beneath them, the king lies, not as a god, not as a ruler, but as a man wrapped in linen, journeying into silence. The pharaohs are gone. Their courts have crumbled, their statues lean. Their names, once carved with trembling hands, are now catalogued by scholars and etched into placards. Their cruelty no longer rules, but the stories they left behind, the warnings, the glories, the sorrows, remain. And in the hush that follows their fall, we are reminded that no power, no matter how divine it claims to be, is beyond time. No monument, no matter how high it reaches, is beyond weather, and no voice, however loud, can speak forever, unless it is remembered with care, with truth, and with the grace of those who refuse to forget. This, then, is the true measure of legacy, not how long one ruled, not how much one built, but how one is remembered when the world grows quiet. And in the quiet, Egypt still speaks.